Hello, I'm John Gertz, SETI theorist, and today I want to speak about the subject of METI. METI is an acronym that stands for Messaging to Extraterrestrial Intelligence. It's highly controversial in the SETI community, and certainly with me it is. And let me not even mince my words and tell you that in my regard, METI is dangerous, arrogant, delusional, unethical, unscientific, illegal, and a quasi-religious cult. It's not merely foolish, but it's downright stupid. Now, I've thrown down the gauntlet. I think the onus is on me to try to explain this a little bit more. The idea behind METI, by some who claim to be SETI scientists and some hangers-on and so forth, is that we've listened for so long for a signal from ET that after 65 years or so of doing SETI, it's now time to take the bull by the horns, and instead of listening for ET to communicate to us, we should signal to them first. So the idea is they haven't talked to us, we'll talk to them. Now, what's wrong with this? First of all, their core argument doesn't particularly hold water. Yes, we've done SETI, we've been listening for ET or for observing astronomically for ET for some 65 years, but really we've had very, very little funding for SETI until recent years. And we've only looked at roughly 1 million stars out of a galaxy of 400 billion stars, just a drop in the ocean, so to speak. Those stars we've only looked at typically for 10 minutes each, in only certain frequency bands and using only certain back-end search algorithms. There's a whole sea of observations that we must take and could take that we haven't yet taken. Today, SETI is funded much better than it ever was before, thanks to the beneficence of Yuri Milner and his Breakthrough Foundation, who have invested approximately $100 million into SETI. Thanks also now to the SETI Institute, which has received a very generous bequest that has reinvigorated their SETI efforts, and thanks also to the Chinese who have gotten into the field independently, so that the SETI of today is much better funded than it ever was before. Additionally, there are very many more telescopes engaged in SETI full-time. They are using far more sophisticated back-end algorithms than they ever used before. And of course, with Moore's law, the back-end has improved exponentially over the decades. So that the SETI today is such that, well, one could say that more SETI is done in a single day today than was done perhaps a decade ago in an entire year. So with that in mind, it would behoove everyone to be a little bit patient and to wait at least decades, if not centuries or millennia, before we have the debate as to whether or not we should proactively transmit to the aliens. So let me use some of their arguments, the METI arguments, and hopefully speak against why they're unfounded. For example, the METIs typically argue that ET may be waiting for us to call. It's, in other words, that the protocol in the galaxy is that they're going to sit back and wait and only engage with those civilizations who want to be engaged with, and they need to signal their intention to be engaged with by signaling first. This is something called the zoo hypothesis, that basically we're a nature preserve, and that the galactic protocol is to leave hands off for a nature preserve unless and until the animals in that preserve, seek out the aliens. However, alternatively, it may well be that we're not in a nature preserve, but in a jungle. And that ET knows something that we don't know, that there's some very dangerous and malicious actors out there in the galaxy, and that it is actually quite dangerous to signal to any other civilization. They're smart enough to keep their heads down and stay silent, and woe to that civilization that is so naive and stupid as to be the ones that transmit. SETIists then argue, but it's too late. I beg your pardon, METIists argue that it's too late. The cat's out of the bag. Aliens are already watching I Love Lucy and not in reruns either. They're looking at it as it was originally transmitted in the 1950s, and all our other sitcoms and our nightly news and so forth. It's all going out at the speed of light and is already covered about the 7,000 or so nearest stars, and every year the wave goes up further and further. However, our omnidirectional electromagnetic leakage is quite weak, and would take an absolutely gargantuan receiver, even at the distance of the closest stars, to be able to pick it up. And moreover, we're going silent. As the years progress, these strong television broadcasts are becoming less terrestrial and more driven by satellites and cables. And consequently, year after year, the Earth is actually becoming quieter. So they also argue that, well, yes, those transmitters, those television transmitters may be quiet, but large, powerful radars, particularly ones used to track asteroids, are not quiet. And it is absolutely true that Arecibo, before its recent demise into a pile of rubble, was the most powerful transmitter in the world, and transmitted at least at a power that's 10,000 times higher than the omnidirectional electromagnetic leakage. Now, it was doing good work. It was looking for asteroids that might collide with Earth. That's a noble endeavor, and no one can disagree with that. However, those radar transmissions were very few and far between. Although powerful, they were few and far between, and most particularly, they weren't aimed at nearby stars. They were aimed sort of randomly at asteroids. The problem can easily be cured by simply saying or informing the community of radar operators that they should not transmit when a nearby star is behind the object that they're transmitting to, an asteroid or whatever. And second, that they shouldn't transmit when their object is transiting the Milky Way, or the plane of the Milky Way where star density is highest. So best practices can avoid the problem. But it's not the same as METI, because whereas these radars are not being transmitted to nearby stars, by very definition, the METIists would transmit to nearby stars. Now, the METIists will argue that they're only following in the footsteps of other METIists. Well, in fact, there have only been dribs and drabs of METI that have been conducted to date. Frank Drake conducted the first METI experiment or transmission in 1974. He transmitted to a globular cluster that was approximately 27,000 light years away. It had no hope of actually being detected at M13, which was the target, which is the name of the globular cluster, because by that time it would have been too weak. It drops with the square of the distance. It would have been too weak to have been received by anything but a transmitter that we can't even imagine how large it would be. Moreover, he missed. He forgot to account for M13's proper motion through the sky, and by the time the signal gets there, M13 will have been gone. Moreover, Frank Drake, who was a dear friend of mine, confessed to me quietly that he's sorry he did it. He wouldn't do it again. He just wanted to demonstrate a proof of concept. Others have done some METI, including Doritos, for an advertisement. But to say that it's okay if we do it because others have done it before us violates a rule that most of us learned in kindergarten, that two wrongs don't make a right. I think we can dispense with that argument. Other METIists will argue disingenuously that they're only conducting METI in order to establish procedures and for communicating with aliens if and when aliens communicate with us. So they need to learn how to construct a message, learn how to program that message into a transmission properly, and so forth. That's sensible. I can agree that message construction is a great thing to study, and very little of it has been done to date. But that doesn't mean you have to hit the send button. You can write the email without hitting send. Alternatively, if they really, for some reason I can't imagine, have to hit the send button, they can do like Frank Drake did and send it to a far distant place, perhaps aimed at a distant galaxy. It doesn't have to be at a nearby star. It's a disingenuous argument. Implicitly, METIists, and by the way, I say ists because I regard it as a cult, and frankly a religious cult, and that's why I call them METIists. But the METIists will argue that ET is all sweetness and light. Let's join the galactic club. All we have to do is message to them that we're ready to join the galactic club. Well, when they tell you that ET is benign, ask them what's the database on which they come to that conclusion. I don't know of any database of alien civilizations and with the number of those that are benign and the number of those that are malicious, listed in two separate columns. I have no idea what they're talking about. Whether ET is as benign as Spielberg's take on ET, or as malicious as Ridley Scott's Aliens series of movies, that's strictly a matter of personal taste. As of this point, there is absolutely no way to determine. They'll argue, well, it has to be benign because, if they weren't benign, they would have self-destructed. Well, look, intelligent species are not always benign. Take dolphins, for example. Well, they're benign to us. They're perfectly harmless or friendly to human beings, another intelligent species, and we get along pretty well with dolphins, I guess. But if you ask another intelligent species, squid, what their opinion of dolphins are, they will call them cruel and heartless murderers, each and every one. So it's possible that dolphins can be kind and benign amongst their own, or to even others like humans, but not benign to all. So there's no particular reason why a surviving ET, just because it survived within its own civilization, cannot be hostile towards other civilizations. Moreover, SETI theorists, when polled, will tell you, in their majority, that they believe that the first ET that they encounter will be artificial, that essentially biological carbon-based beings will have evolved into silicon-based beings. And now these beings, we don't know how they're programmed. Will altruism have been programmed into them? No idea. If they create successive generations, what are called von Neumann replicators, will altruism be programmed in generation after generation of these AI beings? Who knows? Well, those later generations may be so far advanced relative to human consciousness that we can't barely understand anything of their motivations. Okay, Metiists will argue. But what harm could they do us? Astronomical distance are after all astronomical, and how could they possibly hurt us from the distance of the stars? Well, ask a Hittite or an Assyrian, how anybody could have hurt them from the distance that was further than the distance that their arrows could fly. And they would be incredulous that, they would know of no such means of destruction. They couldn't possibly imagine jet bombers and missiles and nuclear weapons, biological weapons, all of this, so for us to take civilizations and assume that even though there are possibly billions of years more advanced than us, they have no way to hurt us across astronomical distances is possibly quite naive. So, for example, they could simply launch a kinetic projectile at something close to approaching the speed of light, a relativistic speed, even 10% of the speed of light. Well, that's already thousands of times faster than the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs, which I think was going something like 17 miles a second instead of light, which goes at 186,000 miles a second. They could send a very tiny projectile that was filled with some sort of self-replicating toxin or self-replicating what's called nano-grade goo, which is little robots that essentially chomp up the entire Earth or all of its usable materials to make replications of themselves. Your science fiction is as good as mine, but to say that they simply can't harm us because our failed imagination can't envision that is probably quite naive. Well, Metiists will say, but we presume we're speaking on behalf of all of mankind and in the name of all of mankind, and we do so altruistically. Well, how dare they speak for all of mankind? Why don't the rest of us have a vote in this thing? First of all, there are two issues there: whether they should speak at all, and what they should say. Well, whether they should speak is a matter of diplomacy. And who appointed them? Earth's diplomats. It's anti-democratic. It doesn't give us any say whatsoever as to whether to communicate or not. The entire fate of the world is left in the hands of a few lonely radio astronomers or other hangers-on to the SETI community. Shouldn't this message and the content of it be approved by a body like the United Nations? First, whether to send it, and then the content of it? Sensitive to this criticism, Metiists will argue back, well, we'll just upload the entire internet. Well, I'm not just a SETI theorist, I'm a businessman, and as a businessman, I particularly object to that. What is the possible currency of trade in the galaxy other than information? If we give them all of our information for free, why in the world would they bother to respond? What I would argue is that if we're going to communicate with them, we might give them a little Beethoven, a painting by Monet, some gamelan music, or maybe one piece by Mozart, and let them barter for the rest of it. Alternatively, if we just upload everything, given that communication inherently can be first costly, but second and most importantly, very dangerous, why would they bother to respond? There's no impetus. So they argue, yeah, but why wait? These guys will start transmitting the moment they're given the keys to some powerful transmitter. Not wishing to sound like petulant children, they'll say, okay, in a perfect world, of course, we would get permission from the United Nations or elsewhere, but that would take too long to do. It's impractical. And I would agree with them. It's not practical for today. But if their cause is just, let them advocate long and hard, convince, and convert people to their wonderful just cause, just like suffrage and the end of slavery and civil rights took generations of struggle. If their cause is like that and so just, let them struggle. But they're aging scientists and they don't have that kind of patience. Well, sorry. When you signed up for METI, you must have known that you're signing up for a mission that might take generations and for which you'll be just a first little stepping stone. That's, with apologies, I told them that's the situation. But they say it's our right of free speech. No. Free speech is not universal, and it's generally acknowledged that free speech takes a back seat to incitement and is limited. You don't yell fire in a crowded theater. You don't incite to violence. And in the United States, our free speech laws are different than in other places. For example, in Europe, in most countries, as I understand it, it's illegal to deny the Holocaust. That's not true in the United States, where free speech is more absolute. So this could be actually quite dangerous. ET may take it as incitement, our attempt to reach out. It may be misinterpreted. Metiists cynically argue, hey, who are you to stop us? It's not against the law. Well, actually, it is. In the United States in particular, there's a law known as the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, which proscribes the transfer of unauthorized technologies to foreign powers that might be of any military use. Well, anything we transmit to ET could be used against us if only in the power of the signal it tells ET just how basically feeble we are, because we don't have a transmitter that is anywhere near as powerful as they must have. So there are some laws in place, but I have to admit that there is no law specifically proscribing METI, and there needs to be. And I'm perfectly in favor of laws governing or prescribing METI through international treaties, through laws on the national level, through agency regulations. Sometimes it takes law a while to catch up to morality. The abolishment of slavery is certainly a prime example of that. Then finally, there's the argument that Metiists make is kind of the trust us, we're scientists. Well, really? They're really scientists? Excuse me, good science experiments are based upon sound methodology. There is no methodology with METI. It's a Hail Mary. You throw out a signal and hope for the best. Let me give you an example of what I mean. In 2008, the Ukrainian astronomer Alexander Zaitsev used the Evpatoria radio telescope to transmit a message to a star called Gliese 581. It's a nearby red dwarf star known to have exoplanets. Now, that star happens to be 21 light years away. So Zaitsev if he had a plan in place for the receipt of the return message, it would have to be 40 years hence after the transmission, which would be the year 2048. Did Zaitsev reserve the telescope for that year? Presumably not. And he died in the year 2021. Moreover, that telescope is now being held by the Russians because it's in Crimea. Now, even if he had some sort of reservation for that telescope in the year 2048, the question is for how long? Because it would certainly take time for the alien civilization on this run this star system to decode our message, to decide within its own society how long it would take to make that decision and to decide what to send back to us to decode our message. Who knows? So should he have reserved that telescope for 10 minutes? 10 hours? 10 days? 10 years? 10 centuries? Who knows? Moreover, one telescope would not be enough because as the Earth rotates, that star would dip below the horizon and would be invisible to that telescope. So you need several telescopes around the world in coordination, all aiming at that same star. Now, METIists don't propose to send to just one star. They would send to multiple stars. Well, you have to magnify the problem that many times over. The METIists would have had to have reserved, at least 3 or 4 telescopes per star and do so for years in order to have something that may be called a real methodology. One could argue that the method is madness, and I would argue that, but at least there would be a method, and it would qualify as some sort of bona fide scientific experiment. But without having any practical plan in place to retrieve a message from ET, essentially, we risk everything if ET is malign, and we have no chance to benefit if ET is benign. Their wonderful cornucopia of knowledge and wisdom and so forth would just flow right past us and we'd miss it all. That's not science. I don't know what it is. Yes, I do know what it is. It's religion. Why is it a religion? Because they believe in an ET that is omniscient, even though our omnidirectional electromagnetic leakage, like I Love Lucy, is very, very weak and unlikely to be retrieved or intercepted by any civilization except with one with have immense receivers. So they're omniscient. They're all good and altruistic. All they care about is our welfare. And they're omnipotent in that even though we've made no provision whatsoever for the receipt of the return message, that somehow they'll make themselves known to us, that they'll take over our from afar, take over our television transmissions or something else. I have no idea what the METIists may be thinking. So, in short, I hope I've convinced you that, as I started at the beginning of this video to say, that METI is dangerous, arrogant, delusional, unethical, unscientific, illegal, and a religious cult. Thank you for tuning in and watching this video. You can learn more about me and about my work at my website, johngertz.com. Until next time.